What is up, Theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity Podcast, where we bring you some ideological ingredients so you can brew your own faith. That's right. And today on the podcast is Larry Hurtado. That's right. I'm a New Testament extraordinaire, historian of the early church. He is the emeritus professor of New Testament language, literature, and theology at the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Now you may be saying to yourself, man, that's across the sea. Yes, but he was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and now he's going to be on the podcast talking about his brand new book, Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctiveness in the Roman World. It is a straight up wonderful conversation. We have a ton of fun, and it's really a discussion of how Christianity was not just distinct and different in the first century, but it completely redefined what we mean by religion, religion's relationship to politics, identity, ethnic groups, empire, and all this kind of stuff. And we need to realize this in order to understand what Christianity, religion, and all those relationships are today. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. So I hope you enjoy it. Before we jump into the podcast, I want to tell you a few things that are headed your way. One, if you live in any of these places, I'm going to be there in the near future in November. That's right, the month this podcast is being released. I'm going to be in San Antonio for the American Academy of Religion, and we have a live podcast at Blue Star Brewing Company. That's right, along with other stuff at the American Academy of Religion. But anyone and everyone in San Antonio, Dallas, and such, you can come to the live podcast at Blue Star Brewing Company. You can get more info about this in all of the places where there's going to be live podcasts on the website. In February, I'm going to be in Cincinnati. That's right. In March, I'm going to be at Progressive Youth Ministry, which is in Asheville, or outside of Asheville, at Montreat. Beautiful place in North Carolina. In May, or April, I'm going to be in Wisconsin. May, I'll be in Atlanta, Georgia. But in January 19th to 21st is Theology Beer Camp in LA, in Redondo Beach. It's going to be awesome. There's no better thing for you to do than in the winter than come spend 3 days at the beach, have wonderful craft beer, and hang out with some theology nerds. And you can do that. You can come out, put it together. This is the first homebrewed Christianity event. It's very homebrewed style. There's like 20 tickets left, and it's going to be full. It's going to be packed. And I'm going to tell you more details. In fact, if you go to the website, there'll probably be a video up there with me telling you like 10 amazing details. But here's one. I had breakfast today with the beer guru of the event. If you like craft beer and enjoying craft beer while having some amazing theology, and I was to tell you about the beer list for this event, you would go nuts. So I don't want to do that because you might be driving. But I will tell you that one of the nights during one of the podcasts, with a number of special guests and musical things that you have no idea what's going to happen at that thing, we are having a battle of the IPA. Yeah, between 5 different rather infamous tasty hop treats on the West Coast. That's right. We may have a little Brett party. We're going to have a whole assortment of styles, but I'm just telling you, one of the podcasts, we're having an IPA battle, and that's just the beginning of the excitement. Next week, you'll hear some more details. I do want to say, I really appreciate all of you that have already gotten your tickets, people that are inviting me out to speak, talk. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful. I love connecting with people, and if you're ever going to be there, like someplace I'm going to be, then make sure you holler at me so I know. We have 3 brand new members to the Homebrewed Christianity Community Group. That's right. And I'm just going to give my shout out to Ryan Smith, Reese Kling, and Cindy Rigsby. Cindy is now a Homebrewed Christianity member. Ryan, you are. Reese, you are. And I'm excited to have you all here. Not only do you obviously end up supporting the podcast, making it a live operation, but you also get to be a part of the secret Facebook group and all sorts of things. And coming up for the members, we have a video series, an 8-part video series that goes through my book, Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus. We actually have a whole study guide that Renee Goodwin at Phillips Theological Seminary, a student there in Homebrewed Christianity Deacon. She has been working on it, sent it to me. We're making it look pretty. You'll be able to get the study guide and 8 little videos you can use to prime the pump for discussion in the group, enjoy on yourself, and that kind of thing. And if you're in the group after you get the videos, then we'll have like a whole little Q&A discussion, chit-chat back and forth about my book, The Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, which was the first in a series, and now there's a brand new one out. That's right. Second one was The Homebrewed Christianity Guide to the End by Jeffrey Pugh, and the third one is The Homebrewed Christianity Guide to God by Eric Hall. Eric Hall, very close friend of mine, good buddy, and he wrote an amazing introduction to the doctrine of God, the history of it, God and religion, God and philosophy, God and theology, God and religious pluralism. It's all covered in this book, along with a very, very developed image of God as Mr. Miyagi. And maybe another image of God as your hippie and who wants to have a drum circle, or God as Jersey Shore. That's right. I mean, there's a whole host of different images of God, and he took these philosophical images and put them in rather funny characters. I was very amused, and you will be too. Personally, I'm very proud of a number of those inserts in the book with the characters that make comments about the book. If you haven't seen any of the books, then you should obviously go get them. All of them. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, I'm very excited for people to get to read Eric's book. I'm looking forward to it. Mostly because it'll be another reason for he and I to get in a big argument, because I like arguing with him. And he's only half right in the book. All the best parts, we agree. It's the other parts I'm worried about. Anyway, this is Larry Hurtado, and we're talking about his book, Destroyer of the Gods. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that I end up seeing you soon. We can connect online. You can go to homebrewedcommunity.com and join the community, be a part of the group, and just go to homebrewedchristianity.com. You can find out about upcoming events. You can invite me out. Most importantly, I think you should really just think about, coming to beer camp in January. It'd be amazing. Amazing. You can also holler at me on Twitter, @TripFuller. Twitter's my favorite thing. If you don't have Twitter, you can use Facebook. But there's a high likelihood. I don't respond to all the messages on Facebook. I just try to avoid Facebook. Twitter is better. I don't know why, but I just feel like it is. I took some survey. Apparently, I'm an ENTP for Myers-Briggs, and apparently ENTPs love Twitter, and I agreed. I know BuzzFeed or whoever it was that made the survey didn't know they were answering something for me, and I said, well, I guess I was just made to love Twitter, and I do. Anyway, I will talk to you soon, because right now you're going to have to listen to this amazing interview, and it's going to blow your mind piece. All right, enjoy. Well, hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today, it's rare that you get to talk to someone who you just had like a 300-page conversation with the night before. But I just finished Larry Hurtado's Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctiveness in the Roman World. And now he's sitting here right on my screen, right in front of me, ready to talk about it. So thank you so much for joining today.
Well, I'm very happy to be here.
So I know that it wasn't that long ago that you retired, and when you retire, scholars that have been so popular, regularly engaged, and taking attentive care to graduate students and all that, finally have a book that they've been wanting to write, that they're going to get to write, and they're going to get to take the time to write it. So where was the origin story for Destroyer of the Gods set in your career?
Well, it came up sometime not long before I retired, which is 2011, in the closing year or so of that period, I think. I developed a sense that initially with reference to other scholars, that in the understandable and legitimate effort to try to make Christianity very much a part of its early Christianity, a part of its Roman world, and to draw connections and similarities and so on with its historical setting, all of which, as I say, is perfectly legitimate. I don't have any issue with that. But it did seem to me that in the effort to do that, there was sometimes a lack of attention to ways in which early Christianity was also different, odd, bizarre even. And so I thought, no, they're only telling half the story sometimes, and the other half needs to be told as well, not to play one off against the other, but simply to balance the ship, you might say. So I thought, I need to address this question. The problem with it, I'd say that was 2010, 2011. The problem was that I'd already given commitments for a whole continuing series of conference presentations, Festschrift or essays for honoring other scholars and other kinds of things that kept popping up. So that I was doing something about producing an essay length, think about every 6 weeks for the ensuing several years, and then I got the invitation to deliver a set of lectures in Hong Kong back in 2013, and toward the end of 2013. And so across 2014, one of my objectives was to write those 4 lectures, which I gave, and thought to myself, this will give me an opportunity to bear down and do the sustained work that will form the embryo of this book that I want to write. So I did that, and then spent 2015 taking those 4 lectures, expanding and adding some other stuff to it, and wrote it across 2015.
Mm-hmm. So when you're looking back at your career now, what were the moments in young scholar Larry's life where he said, I think I want to do this so long that I retire with a stack of invitations and get to write the book I've been wanting while lecturing in Hong Kong? Because I know a lot of friends that are graduate students that are regularly going, how did I get here? Is this where I need to be? Lots of people and early in their academic careers going, what am I doing? I could make as much as a barista. What is it that as a vocation and as a person of faith and that kind of thing, where you knew this is where you needed to go, and you kind of look back to as a scholar to stay focused on all the work you've done?
It wasn't a straight line. I was invited when I was doing undergraduate study. Well, actually, at the end of doing my master's work, at the end of doing master's work, which I did because I was simply interested in the subject and wanted to go further than my undergraduate work allowed. So I did a master's degree focusing in New Testament studies. And as I was finishing that, I got an invitation to do what was initially just a 1 or 2 year teaching stint to fill in for a couple of faculty members at a college who had suddenly left. And until they could get a permanent replacement, they needed somebody at the last minute. So they approached me in summer and said, can you come and do a year or 2 of teaching? As I did that, I thought to myself, this is where I would really like to make my career if I can. And I knew that I would need a PhD to do that really. So that committed me to doing PhD work. As I finished PhD work, before I finished it, my fellowship ran out. And so I had to find other means of putting food on the table. I took a job pastoring a small church in the greater Chicago area. And I actually was very happy there. I was surprised to myself. I actually grew into the situation, and after a couple of years thought, this is not so bad. These people are very good to me. I could stay here. And then out of the blue came an invitation to interview for a post at a theological college or Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia. So I took that invitation, and when I saw what they were and what kind of mission the college had and so on, it was very attractive. So that gave me an opportunity to get into academia in post-PhD work. That job didn't last. I was then in need of a job again after 2 or 3 years, and wound up, much to my surprise, getting an appointment in the University of Manitoba, which is a public university in Winnipeg. I'd always assumed I'd be teaching at a kind of Christian-related place, and wound up my services were no longer required at the Christian place. And so I wound up at the University of Manitoba, a secular place, so to speak, and was there for 18 years. And that's really where my career kind of took off. And then in 96, offered the chair of New Testament here in Edinburgh. Again, I was probably much more surprised than any of my critics. So So it's not been a straight line. It's kind of been a whole series of career surprises at various points.
Well, I don't think most people that are nerdy Bible lovers growing up in Kansas City, Missouri, think I'll teach at a secular school in Canada and then head over across the pond.
No, it's every move has been a bit of a surprise, as I say, to me as much to anybody else.
So when you're, coming into this book, part of what you're bringing is a renewed emphasis on the beliefs coming out of the practices and doxologies of the early church. That for a lot of kind of New Testament scholars and early church historians, there's been lots of debate about the diversity of thought in the early church, when Christology got higher, how Jesus became God, and this type of thing. And I would just say that on top of this new book being the most readable book, like I could imagine handing it to someone that didn't go to seminary, it also shows some of the payoff of having honed your eye towards different data and focus in dealing with the early church. So can you describe how you see your kind of previous work connecting to the way you frame the questions and engaged the early church and its distinctiveness?
Well, there's not perhaps, I have to say, perhaps there's not a direct logical connection or heuristic connection. It's the only connection, I guess, is me. I mean, I have various questions. Some of the publications that I've done over the years have been in textual criticism and in the study of early Christian manuscripts, their physical and visual features. And so some people have said, what the heck does that have to do with the study of the origins of Christology? And nothing directly. I mean, it isn't as though the conclusions to one question depend upon the other, but it reflects something of the kind of, I guess, eclectic nature of my personality, that I'm interested in physical realia questions about manuscripts, but also deeply interested in the nature of early Christian faith and religious practice. The other thing is that my work over the years has been very much focused on kind of historical questions. I am guilty of being a Christian, so I actually sort of take all this stuff seriously. Woe is me. But my professional work is mainly sort of historical work, which I put out there for anybody to engage, regardless of their faith stance. It's not a work of apologetics or an attempt to play to some particular gallery. And this book, the difference between previous work, I suppose, and this one is that this one I deliberately wrote in order to make it pass muster, I hope, with scholars, but to address a wider reading public. So if the book succeeds, and it's too early to tell yet, but if the book succeeds, it would reach a wider general audience readership, as you say, who not only haven't been to seminary, but people who may or may not even believe in Christianity at all. I mean, it's intended to say, whether you do or you don't, Christianity has been a powerful cultural influence, particularly in European and European influenced cultures. And you may not realize how much influence it's had. And whether you're a Christian or not, you may have no notion of how odd and bizarre it really was in its originating moments. Mm-hmm. So it's simply intended to say, if all you want is something like a kind of History Channel documentary on what the heck was Christianity like in its first couple of centuries, read my book. That's all. That's all that's involved. Well,
and I think kind of one of the things that you capture very quickly, and is one of the reasons I can imagine so many people enjoying it, is a really thick description of what the Roman world was. Because as you come to find out, as you go through the book, so much of our cultural assumptions, even ones that are in this disenchanted secular world with a public square and all that kind of stuff, have an origin from this really distinctive, odd religion in the Roman world. So if you're thinking of describing the Roman world and the conversation around religion and the gods, what did that mean then? What did it mean to say that I believe in the gods, or what did religion look like then?
Well, one of the points I try to make, building on some work of other scholars, is that actually our category of religion is a relatively recent conceptual category. I think some scholars have traced it to maybe not much earlier than the 18th century. Obviously, there were gods and things we call religion around, but they didn't call it religion as such. Mm-hmm. They didn't have a similar term. What we mean by religion often is, acting in a way toward a god or gods, and it's something we do on Sunday or something we do on Sabbath, or something that is distinguishable from, say, our economic life or our political life or married life or whatever. But the crucial thing is that in the classical world in which Christianity appeared, the gods and relationships to the gods were woven through virtually all other aspects of life. There was no distinction between what we mean by religion and politics or ethics or social life. So the gods were everywhere. The gods were ubiquitous and inseparably connected to virtually every social occasion and political occasion. So, to say the more important question is not, what did it mean to believe in the gods? And by the way, the primary expression of what we mean by religion in the ancient world wasn't belief. That's another way in which Christianity has shaped our assumption. We think of religion as believing certain things. That derives from Christianity, which has placed such an emphasis on creed. But in the ancient world in which Christianity emerged, religion and allegiance to the gods was primarily manifested in ritual behavior, in offering sacrifice, in worship. Mm-hmm. And so atheism, which is interesting, as I point out, one of the things that early Christians were accused of being atheists. And you think, how in the devil could that be? Because they obviously had a God, at least one God. They had God and Jesus, sort of a God and a spare kind of thing. So how could they be atheists? Answer, because they didn't worship the gods of the Roman pantheon, the gods of the Roman world, which undergirded family and society and politics and all aspects of life. The Christians were expected to say rubbish to all that, to refuse stubbornly to offer sacrifice or worship to these gods. And in the Roman world, to refuse to worship a god was effectively to deny the god. Mm-hmm. So the refusal of Christians to participate in the communal worshiping activities that characterized the Roman world was justifiably, in the eyes of Roman people, earned the accusation of atheism.
So in the first century, you talk about there being this connection of religion as a part of the fabric of family and civics and politics and ethnic identity, and in just the normal social order, right? Like between people in different classes and places in the system. When you turn towards Christianity and it becomes this thing that is odd and is criticized and pushed against, what was it that made Christianity different than kind of the Jewish exception to this monotheistic distance from the Roman ritual type of religion?
That's an obvious question. Yes, early Christians refused to worship the gods. And you think, but for a few centuries before that, Jews were expected to take a very similar stance. And those who were loyal Jews, you might say, loyal to their tradition, also said, no, we don't worship the gods. We don't participate in what they regard as the pagan rituals. The difference is this. In the eyes of the Romans, the Jewish peculiarity of not worshiping the gods was seen as an ethnic peculiarity. For them, that's what Jews did because they were Jews. It was a particularly, in the eyes of most people, odious, odd, objectionable aspect of the Jewish nation. But hey, it's their national ethnicity. It's what they do. And similarly, they might say, the Egyptians are kind of crazy. Their gods are shaped like animals. Everybody knows the gods can't be shaped like animals. They have to be humans.
Obviously.
The Egyptians are kind of crazy. They worship cats and dogs and crocodiles and God knows what. Who knows? Who cares? They're Egyptians. Let them do their thing. the Romans, in that sense, were really quite tolerant of ethnic peculiarities. Every nation had its peculiarity, and the Jews only more so, in that they refused to worship anybody else's gods. But when what we call early Christianity comes along, it is at an early point multi-ethnic or trans-ethnic. Mm-hmm. And becoming a Christian did not involve becoming a member of a particular nation. If you were Syrian or Egyptian or Roman or whatever you were, you kept your ethnic identity, and you weren't expected to renounce your family. You stayed as a member of your family, but you were not to worship the gods of your family or the gods of your city or the gods of your tribe or nation. And yet you remained within that nation, city, family. So this is what made early Christianity different, and also what made early Christianity much more disruptive. If Jews as a nation practice a particular kind of collective practice that everybody else finds odd, that's one thing. But if you have a religious movement that starts recruiting people that are your son-in-law or your daughter or your wife or your neighbor who, the day before yesterday was participating in the worship of the gods, and then this week they suddenly announce, I'm sorry, I don't do that anymore. I've now become a follower of this Jesus thing, or become a Christian. You're thinking to yourself, what the devil is going on here? This is disruptive socially. And so accusations that we find in early critics is Christians break up families, they disrupt the city, they endanger the empire because they are breaking up the religious and social solidarity that otherwise obtained.
When I've been told the story in different kind of New Testament classes, this parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, and its coming to be distinctive in a Roman context, was connected to the destruction of the temple, and Paul winning out and some animals on a sheet persuading Peter good missiology doesn't require circumcision, which as a Gentile I'm in full support that would really impact calls to repentance. But what is like the layer beneath these kind of normal tropes when you start to pay attention to the distinctiveness of Christianity in contrast to both Judaism and the Roman world as it becomes a distinct trans-ethnic religion?
Well, I think there are two distinguishable but related questions that you've mentioned. One is, at what point do we have, let's put it this way, at what point do we have a new religion that disassociates itself from its Jewish context in which it emerged? Mm-hmm. That is a process that takes some time, and I'm fully in agreement that it doesn't happen all at once. There isn't a council that makes this decision. It happens across at least a century or two, probably, and probably proceeds at a different pace in different settings. And there are some people, for example, Jewish followers of Jesus, Jewish Christians, as they sometimes referred to, would have seen themselves both as Jewish and as what we would call Christian. Mm-hmm. So they didn't have a parting of the ways. They embodied both identities within their persons. So that's one thing, is what's the historical process by which we have the emergence of a new religion in some sort of historical sense? That's not what I'm after. And what I'm basically pointing out is that long before that parting of the ways occurred, whenever it occurred, 2nd century, 4th century, various ideas suggested. But from the earliest moments, we know, certainly in the 30s and 40s already, we know that the Jesus movement, and we can use that term to describe the early stage of it before it became a separate religion. We can refer to it as the Jesus movement, because it's a movement that emerges within Judaism, but with Jesus as a particular focus. This Jesus movement is very early on making converts of pagans. It's trans-ethnic and making converts of what Jews call Gentiles, or what the rest of us call pagans. People like you and me, I suspect. And so from a very early point, this process is going on. Certainly, once the Apostle Paul becomes an adherent of this movement, which takes place, we think, in the early 30s, not very long thereafter, he's engaged programmatically in a translocal, trans-ethnic programmatic effort to bring the godless nations to the God of Israel through baptism in the name of Jesus and so on. So for him and other people like him, the Jesus movement is a multi-ethnic, trans-ethnic religious movement, and therefore causing these kinds of disturbances in the eyes of pagans, even well before it is judged to be a new religion. It's let's say at this point, it's still a peculiar, bizarre, emergent movement within the diverse Jewish tradition of the Second Temple period. But it is already distinctive and objectionably bizarre in the eyes of many non-Jews.
So in the first century, why would an individual become a Christian?
Well, it's an interesting question. I gave a lecture earlier this year, which has been published as a little book with the title, Why on Earth Did Anyone Become a Christian in the First 3 Centuries? If you want to get it, it's available from Marquette University Press, and that's the title of the book. And that's the question that I'm asking, is not simply in the first century, but in the first 3 centuries. That is to say, particularly before Constantine, the emperor, legitimates Christianity, gives it a right to exist in the early 4th century. Before that time, right up until that period, Christianity is a small sect, comparatively so in the larger environment of the Roman world, very vulnerable. It is regarded with hostility and with suspicion by large numbers of people. There are wild rumors circulating about Christians. They're accused of being cannibals. They're accused of orgiastic sex. They're accused of all kinds of terrible things, which most people don't take seriously. But more seriously, the more sophisticated people are accusing them, as I said earlier, of social, familial, and political disloyalty and subversiveness. So they're being attacked, they're being ridiculed, they're being lampooned by people like Lucian. They're being formally attacked and refuted by people like the Roman orator Celsus in the late 2nd century. And at various points, culminating in a whole series of pretty brutal efforts in the 3rd century, they're even being subjected to state persecution, which included often executions and imprisonments and so on. So that's the reason why I asked the question. People say, well, early Christianity afforded people a wonderful, what some people call a fictive family, a group of brothers and sisters that they could feel connected to. So if they were living in an urban setting, kind of disconnected maybe from their natural family back in the old country, on the countryside, well, a lot of people move to the city. They kind of lose their social connections, their family connections. So early Christianity said, not to worry, you can be a part of this little Christian church, and everybody here's a brother and a sister. And my response is, yeah, but we know from the various investigations of so-called voluntary associations in the Roman world that there were oodles of such opportunities. There were scores of voluntary associations you could join. And we know from some of them, from the evidence that we have, that they also used brother-sister language and had very strong bonding. So if you wanted that, you didn't have to join this ridiculed, lampooned, suspicious community called Christians. You could get the same benefits from joining any number of other groups. So I repeat the question, why on earth would you become a Christian when there was this massive social cost that was involved that, so far as I can tell, was not involved in joining any other religious movement in the Roman world? Mm-hmm. Toward the end of that lecture and the end of that little book, I explore one or two possible reasons. The basic point that I'm making in the book, however, is that scholars and people who want to appreciate early Christianity, Jesus, just simply from a kind of general reader level, mm-hmm. that we need to take seriously that question in assessing early Christianity. People have tended to ask questions like, how or why did early Christianity grow? And that's a legitimate question. But my point is, but you can't assess the growth of Christianity or the growth of adherence in early Christianity without asking the more pointed question, why on earth would anybody become a Christian in this period when there were such major social costs? Mm-hmm. And the obvious answer is, in some sense, early Christianity must have offered to people goods, you might say, religious goods of some sort, that people judged worth the exchange. The beliefs of early Christianity, the religious experiences of early Christianity, perhaps the moral values and moral teachings of early Christianity, perhaps for some people, various factors, may have weighed differently for different people. But whatever it was, in each individual case, the individual had to judge, there's going to be hell to pay if I become a Christian with my neighbors, my family, whatever. But for this reason, or these reasons, whatever they were, it's worth it.
So when I think of how this book connects to a number of contemporary New Testament scholars that are engaging around this distinctiveness in the early church, I think I could think of a few of them that would have titled the book Destroyer of Empire, and have read different features of distinctiveness, the ethical call on distinctiveness, and that type of stuff, as the early church being inherently anti-imperial. And while you do point out the places in which Christianity is the downfall of the Roman Empire in one form and that type of stuff, but you also think there's more and other things going on. Can you kind of describe why the issue is gods as opposed to Christianity as, destroyer of empire?
Well, two things I guess I would want to say. One is that, remember, as I said before, that the gods and all other aspects of life are inseparable. Mm-hmm. And so to regard Roma, the goddess on whom the Roman Empire rests, to regard Roma as demonic, as an unworthy being, which is the kind of language that early Christians used about the pagan gods. If the Roman Empire rests upon the authority and validity of gods like Roma or the other Roman pantheon, and the early Christians say these gods are all rubbish, they're all unworthy beings and perhaps even evil demonic beings, that does call into question, in the eyes of people who are supporters of the Roman regime and society, that would seem to them as if it is subversive. The early Christians, it's therefore interesting to me, and this is the reason why this is the case, I think, that therefore when you look at early Christian texts, with a few exceptions, perhaps the most notable exception being the book of Revelation with its starkly, bitter critique of the Roman Empire as a monster, the monster who comes forth. But with a few exceptions, such as Revelation, most other early Christian texts actually advocate obedience to the Roman authorities, paying your taxes, showing the governors and the Roman Emperor himself obedience and honor and respect, and writings such as First Peter, which basically says try to avoid getting into any trouble with people, and try to see that you don't break any laws or anything. If you are called to account to answer for your Christian faith, okay, you can't duck the issue. You have to face it and give your confession. But otherwise, try to avoid any sort of trouble with the authorities. Go along and be good citizens. Something like the writing from the 2nd century known as the Epistle to Diognetus, which likewise says, it seems to be addressed to pagan observers. And the guy says, we're just like you. We wear the same clothes. We eat the same food. And we support the empire. We pay our taxes. We pray for the emperor that he will survive and that the empire will survive. And so on the one hand, you say, well, that doesn't sound very anti-imperial. And so, yes, I have to say that some of the current emphasis, some of us might say bad, but that would be pejorative, finding anti-imperial rhetoric and anti-imperialism under every nook and cranny of early Christian literature. Some of the rest of us, and I'm one of those, don't find that terribly persuasive, because at least on the surface level, most early Christian texts are actually saying the opposite. They're saying, no, we pray for the empire and pray for the emperor that God will preserve them and enable them to rule effectively and fairly. They also warn the emperor, however, and the authorities, if you rule unfairly, if you do not reward if you do not reward good and punish evil, if you do the opposite, then there's going to be hell to pay. God's going to get you. They warn them against that. But they say, but if you're a good emperor, if you enforce the fair laws and you keep the seas free of pirates and you put down brigands in the countryside, and you see to it that the water aqueducts are supplied, we'll pray for you and hope that God will keep you and preserve you and bless you. At the same time, however, of course, we regard all of the gods on whose authority your empire rests as complete rubbish. So, but beyond that, we're willing to be good citizens. Now, the problem is that that's a bargain that most Romans weren't willing to make. That is, the dominant pagan view was, I'm sorry, that's an unacceptable bargain. You know, it's either accept the empire and the gods and the whole schmozzle, or else you are seditious. So it's one of the points I make is that the early Christians, in their stance of saying we are loyal to the empire, we are loyal to our family as far as we can, loyal to our city, but we depart from the gods on whom all these structures rest, that early Christianity actually seems to invent what we would call a separate religious identity. That is, early Christianity seems to effect a separation between what we would call religion, that is the God you reverence and your religious responsibilities, and your political and social loyalty. In the early Roman world, these are inseparable. The one rests upon another. The early Christians say, we don't accept the gods on whom you claim to base your authority, but we will pray and we will support you in your rule anyway. We have our own reasons and our own reasons for praying for you, and it has nothing to do with what you say. So they affect a kind of interesting separation between religious loyalty and social and political loyalty.
You mentioned paying taxes in the example. The other one that kind of gets pulled up pretty often is serving in the military. How does this kind of reworking of that self-identity and distinctive, exclusive claimed identity in Christianity look when it goes to a Christian being a soldier?
It seems to me that in the early centuries, and particularly in the first 3 centuries, again, before Christianity becomes legitimate and before it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. I mean, after that point, Christians can serve in the army and do seem to serve in the army. People, at least who call themselves Christians, serve in the army on a much more frequent basis. But in the period in which there is this conflict between Christianity and the religious demands of the Roman Empire, and that includes the religious demands of the army, it's much more problematic because every Roman legion has its own guardian gods, and members of the Roman legion are expected to join together in worship and petition to these guardian gods before they go into battle or whatever, believing that if they keep the gods on their side, they're more likely to win the battle. So again, even the army and Roman gods are closely linked. So for Christians, how could they serve in the army? How could they serve in a legion when they are not supposed to participate in worshiping the gods of that legion? So it was, again, what we would call not so much or not solely a question of can you kill with a sword, but it was also, and perhaps even more directly, a question of how can you be a member of the Roman army because that's to commit idolatry. You have to engage in actions which in Christian faith are idolatry, worshiping false gods. However, it does look as though from even in the early centuries, that there were Christians who served in Roman armies. There were Christians who opposed it altogether, and there were Christians who served. So it's one of the ways in which in the earliest centuries, on this as on a number of other things, Christians did not agree.
Well, we have a long history of debates.
Yes.
When you're hearing this type of discussion and the wrestling with identity in the Roman Empire, I can't help but think of the different types of responses Christians have today in the West about the influence of immigrants on culture and identity, both in the United States and in Europe right now. It's not like there's an insistence, we need everyone to come here and be Christian. It's more, we need everyone to come here and learn the language, participate in our culture. We don't want like a tossed salad of different identities. We want a nice melting pot. And that the distinctiveness or exclusiveness part of Christianity in the Roman Empire was connected to this request to have permission to be different and for all of you to potentially be one of us.
Yes, it's been suggested, and I think that it's pretty persuasive that that the earliest writing that explicitly articulates a teaching of religious freedom is probably in Tertullian, the early Latin church writer of the early 3rd century, and he writes there basically saying in an apologia or a defense address to the Roman government that it is right and just that each person should be free to worship the gods that they choose, that they should have religious freedom, and that it is not the business of the state it should not be the business of the state to enforce some kind of religious conformity, and that people can still be loyal citizens of their city and of their empire, but allowing them the freedom to choose how they wish to be religious. That, as far as we know, that's the first time that kind of separation of religious belief and practice and social identity really gets articulated, with the added idea that individuals should have the right to choose freely their religiousness. I guess we have to keep in mind that after Christianity became legalized by Constantine, and then thereafter it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, in European society, particularly thereafter, Christianity was sort of the official religion of many European countries. In England, not in Scotland where I live, but in England, of course, the Church of England is still the official state church of England. And so bishops of the Church of England sit in the House of Lords, and the Queen is, or the King or Queen, whenever they're coronated, are coronated or crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury of the Church of England. So there's this tight connection, and that tended to be characteristic of many European societies. And in those societies as well, it was often thought that religious diversity was a threat to the social and political stability of the kingdom. And so often, in the classic Reformation, wars between Protestants and Catholics, for example, that was even the difference between Protestant and Catholic was thought to be politically, socially disruptive and unacceptable. So lots of martyrdoms occurring then, probably more martyrdoms occurring in the Reformation, perhaps, than under the Romans, with Catholics and Protestants killing each other. So there's a sense in which after Constantine and the legitimation and legalization of Christianity, the relationship between religion and the state becomes much more ambiguous. Mm-hmm. It actually takes on some features of the old pagan notion that you have to have one religion in order to hold the country together. However, the United States, of course, and in particular, is probably the first of the Western countries in the late 18th century, the first of the countries of the West to embrace, at least nominally, a kind of multi-religious character and to refuse to have any official religion. So when people say, today the United States is a Christian country, that is never been the case officially. The founding fathers, Jefferson and the rest of them, were always quite keen to say there is no official religion, and in principle, therefore, religious diversity was allowed, and it was not thought to be an obstacle to political loyalty and cohesiveness. Mm-hmm. So I guess that kind of view has then kind of spread in countries such as Britain and in many other of the European countries, even those countries that retain an official church, as in England. There is still now, however, a programmatic attitude that says, but we embrace religious diversity. And in principle, Muslims or Sikhs or Jews or Christians or Hindus or Buddhists or whoever, and quite a number of people in the most recent survey in Britain who describe themselves as Jedi. So, I mean, there's various religious expressions, but the idea is now pretty much, it doesn't matter. In principle, you can all be loyal citizens, and we trust you all. until you give us reason to think otherwise. But it's got nothing to do with your religious identity. If you yourself, engage in terrorism, okay, that's a problem. But we don't criminalize any particular religious belief as such. That's in some sense a modern fruition and triumph of an appeal that has its earliest expression, ironically, in a Christian writer, Tertullian, in the early 3rd century.
Yeah, the one of the things that I've always found hard to describe, I guess, to Protestants is the connection between the ritual life of the church and the emergence of its beliefs in the early church, because Protestants are born at a time where if you ask the question, like at the beginning of the interview, we asked, what does it mean to talk about the gods and religion? It's Christendom. And religious diversity are expressions of Christianity and Christendom. And the world they existed in is one where the notion of God was already thoroughly Christianized, that the very language and theology that they're inheriting in the tradition and working with and reforming was forged at a time where there wasn't these common assumptions. That in the early church, the Christological controversies and pushing against these different theologies came in a world where those theological conclusions were exclusive of people in their culture and defining of a distinct minority identity. And I wonder, as a historian, if something changes when we take Christological conclusions and language out of a place where the church is a minority distinctive religion that's even redefining what it means to be religious, and then put those same beliefs next to an emperor in a world where Christendom is just assumed and the Christian identity is given with your citizenship.
Yes, that's one of the major changes, is that once Christianity, a reform of Christianity, imperial Christianity, becomes the official religion of the empire, then anything else becomes dissonance, becomes divergence. Of course, ironically, as I'm saying, in the first 3 centuries, Christianity was the divergence. It was the odd man out in some sense, or the suspicious activity. But once Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, things change enormously. And thereafter, anything but Christian, and indeed in the case of, as exemplified by the wars between Protestants and Catholics, anything but a particular kind of Christian. You had Protestant in this German state, or Catholic in that German state, or Orthodox in that Eastern European state.
And it came with an argument like, where the prince goes, so the people go,
absolutely.
Which is not
one king, one blood, one nation, one religion was the kind of dominant attitude amongst many of these peoples, and that's absolutely foreign to the originating centuries of early Christianity. So it's one of the things that I hope modern readers of the book will recognize, is that the earliest centuries of Christianity are quite a bit different in many ways from the form of Christendom that people will have assumed. And yes, early Christianity is asserting that there is only one true God, in a context in which most people believe and know very otherwise, know that there are lots of gods, and they're all good gods, or all valid gods. Early Christianity is the one that's coming along and being bloody-minded about the whole thing and saying, no, all of these other gods are rubbish. There is only one true God, and the other gods are rubbish. As I said, this, for example, is one instance of something that has now become a cultural commonplace for us. So as I say in one of the chapters, if you were to go out on the street with a microphone and ask people, do you believe in God? You would probably get one of 3 answers: yes, no, or I'm still making up my mind. Nobody would probably think to ask you the obvious question, which is, pardon me, but can you tell me which of the gods it is you're talking about? As I say, in the West, even atheists assume that there's only one God to doubt. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a bizarre notion in the history of the world. Down through human history, the default position has been, but of course there have to be multiple gods to account for the complexity of the world. Early Christianity, inheriting this bloody-minded, so to speak, exclusivism from its Jewish context, was saying, no, there's only one God. And they weren't original in saying that. Jews had been saying that for a few centuries at least. But what the early Christians did was, as I've said, to take this beyond simply the ethnicity of Jews and to make it a new kind of translocal, transethnic religious movement that, of course, by the 2nd century or 3rd century has become a new distinguishable religion.
Yeah, I wonder if there's not something for us to gain today in recognizing that, and then also recognizing that 500 years ago, right, you wouldn't know what it meant to be an atheist because that was just not an available option. In the early church, you were an atheist if you believed in one exclusive, non-ethnic type of deity. Then how does this believing type of religion communicate itself in a world where if you ask the question God, you do have those three answers, and everyone would know what it's like to be on the other side, right? Like we live in this disenchanted world with these hints of transcendence, and you have the yes or no to some historic wisdom, tradition, orthodoxy, and then you have this exploration of all sorts of new types of spiritual experiences and encounters and such. And you also have like this scientific reductive materialism that just says, no. But in that space, what is it like to inherit the wisdom of the early church when the question of God was contested not just in the reality of God, but in the reality and character of the God you're describing?
Yeah, I guess just to underscore a couple of things, for us, you're quite right. The primary expression in the minds of most people, I suppose, the primary expression of religion is belief. Actually, my guess is that conception is held much more firmly and in a much more unexamined way by non-believers than by believers. I mean, I have had the experience of having atheists on the podcast, and I say that, and they look at you and are like, "No, you are not allowed to be a Christian unless you believe God was pissed and had to kill Jesus and can randomly intervene whenever God wants, and if God doesn't, God's a jerk. That's what you have to believe." And I'm like, and so people say, I can't hold this series of beliefs, or you must hold these series of beliefs. So it's a kind of checklist of things that you intellectually somehow screw your face up to be able to subscribe to. Again, in the ancient world, when people were called atheists, it had little to do with what they believed. I mean, we know that there were various philosophical traditions which speculated about what the gods were, even whether the gods really existed, or whether they gave a damn about the world. And you were free to do that. That was not a problem. Nobody persecuted you for that, so long as you continued to participate in the rituals devoted to the gods. And even these philosophers who doubted whether the gods really existed, so far as we know, they never abstained or encouraged other people to abstain from the ritual observances that were dedicated to the deities. To fail to participate in those ritual observances was what atheism was. That was more important than belief. Now, for us today, particularly, as I say, probably non-believing people, probably presume that belief is the primary thing. To some degree, that is part of the influence of Christianity, because early Christianity comes along, even in that early Roman setting, and says, and the primary thing about early Christianity toward the gods was not, we deny the existence of the pagan gods. That wasn't what they said typically. It was, we deny that these beings are worthy of being treated as gods. They are unworthy beings. And very often, indeed, they're quite ready to say, no, there really are beings. Those pagan gods really do exist, but they are unworthy beings, perhaps in some cases even referring to them as demonic beings, evil beings. So it wasn't a matter of believing that the gods exist or not, but of how you regarded them. And that introduces me to the other point that you were getting at. Early Christianity, in its God talk, in its where it joins the issue of the gods, if you look carefully at what the early Christians say about their God, it's quite different from what the gods are described as being in the larger Roman environment. One example will illustrate this. I have been unable to find thus far, and I've consulted with a number of people who are much more expert in the Roman pagan environment than I am. I've been unable to find thus far any indication in the Roman era religious environment, pagan religious environment, of reference to the gods loving people or loving the world. That just isn't a part of pagan religious discourse. They will talk about the gods being generous or merciful or kindly disposed or generous or anything like that sometimes. But particularly the notion of the gods loving the world and exercising care of the world with that kind of motivation. It's not a part of pagan discourse. I haven't been able to find a single example of that. It is, of course, ubiquitous all through early Christian literature. It's hard to find any of the New Testament writings or other early Christian writings that in their talk about the Christian notion of deity that fail to say, oh, and by the way, this God is a God who is moved and motivated by powerful love for the world, love for creation, love for the human race at large. And consequently, of course, the effect upon Christian teachings about behavior is, and what does this God require by way of behavior? Sacrifices? Nope. Altars? Nope. Images? Nope. Priesthood? Nope. What does this God require above all? That you love one another and that you even love your enemies. Now, this discourse about divine love being the motivation behind everything, God, famous statement from the Gospel of John, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. So here, the whole notion of the role of Christ, Jesus, in early Christian discourse is an expression of God's love. And then references of Jesus' action. Paul refers to the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So again, Jesus' death is described as a loving, self-sacrificial act. We can multiply these by hundreds probably in early Christian literature. All that to say, the image and the character of the deity that early Christians talk about, as this one example will show, is categorically different from the way in which the gods are described in pagan discourse of the time. And if you were to go out into the street with a microphone and say to people, whether you believe in God or not, if there is a God, if there is a God, do you think that this God loves the world? My guess is that most people would say, yes, of course. I'm not sure I believe there's a God, but if there is one, yeah, I suppose he would love the world. Yeah, sure, why not? Again, that's a bizarre notion in the history of the world. Not only in the Roman period, but down through history. It's very hard to find any people or society who imagine that any of the gods love them. Early Christians, however, and again, drawing upon a motif that comes from their Jewish past, the Old Testament past, but they magnify it and promote it, and as I said, take it to the streets in a programmatic way. They are pushing this idea of their God as a loving God and a God who is motivated by love. So it's a different ideology. It's a different understanding of deity, and so it is a critique of religion on the basis of a novel religious ideology. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there's something real important to that, because even in secular age, Charles Taylor highlights that the secular self narrative is that reason and science and all these things kind of slowly diminish and deflate claims about God and that type of thing. But he's like, no, that's not what happened, if you pay attention to the history, it was primarily the parting of reason and confidence and order and the things that science kind of needed got separated from God when the question of theodicy was raised more and more after the Libsyn earthquake and all the way to the Holocaust. That it's the assumption that the ordered universe that is, you can learn about through science is the result of a God who knows your name, knows your face, and cares. It's the loving part that's challenged by the bloody bench of human history, and starts to create this gap where you're able to culturally have like meaning and values and truth and all these things that Christianity brings into the culture, separated from its concept of God as Abba, really, like within early Christianity.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess I would underscore 2 points there. One is that the early Christian discourse about their God, the way in which they describe their God, is quite distinctive in comparison to the way in which the gods are described in the Roman world at large. So it is a different conception of what the word theos or God means in early Christianity. And secondly, that conception of who their God is directly tied, has direct implications on values, practices, behavior, and that again is a bizarre notion in the Roman world. Again, as I point out, in the Roman period, if you want to learn how to behave, how to live a good life, how to succeed in life, it never would have occurred to you to turn to religion. The gods have no interest in that, or are not the sources of that. If you want to learn how to live, you turn to philosophy. Because religion is basically not how to live. Religion is how to keep the gods happy, keep them on your side, and see to it that things go your way. Early Christianity, again, influenced by its Jewish background, conceives of a deity who is concerned about your behavior, who in fact has quite a lot of rules about how you're to live your life, and whose character has implications for your character formation. So there is this, again, very different notion of, one of the things I point out is that today people will say, I don't like religion because it's all about do's and don'ts. Again, that's an utterly, yes, it's true. Christianity is all about do's and don'ts, but that's a bizarre kind of religion. In the Roman world, religion had little to do with do's and don'ts. It was philosophy that told you do's and don'ts. But early Christianity, again, it's one of the other distinctive ways in which it's a very different kind of religion. Indeed, it's so different that one of my friends and highly respected colleagues in ancient history in Macquarie University in Australia, a guy named Edwin Judge, who's now a very senior guy and very well-respected figure in ancient history, has insisted to me when I sent him some of the early chapters of the book to read. He wrote back and said, you mustn't call early Christianity a religion. It wasn't a religion in any recognizable sense of the word in the Roman world. They didn't have temples. They didn't have shrines. They didn't have altars. They didn't have sacrifices. They didn't have priests. It's not a religion. It's all about, they read texts and they tell people how to live. Oh, sure, they pray, but that's irrelevant, and so on. And he's right. I take his point that it doesn't fit the checklist of what religion was. And I simply wrote back and said, Edwin, I take your point, but I think if I follow your advice, the general readers whom I'm writing won't be able to understand what the devil is I'm saying. So I'm going to characterize early Christianity as a very different kind of religion. Mm-hmm. Okay. But you see the point that he's making, that it is so very different that a good, competent historian such as him can say, I'm not even sure we should even call it a religion in the Roman sense of the word.
So if you're thinking of early Christianity, what then is distinct about its practices of baptism and communion? How do you understand those? And then this distinctiveness of its a bookish flavor?
Well, yeah, the things such as baptism and their common meal and other actions they do have rituals. And so that's part of the reason why I've pushed back against Edwin Judge and said, yeah, but they don't fit the checklist of what Romans thought a religion ought to be, but they do have some things. I mean, they do have rituals, for example. They have an entrance rite, baptism, and it is an entrance rite that involves invoking the name of Jesus, who is there, is accorded a kind of divine status. They do have a common meal. And in at least many cases, we know that from the earliest expression that this common meal is a sacred meal, is a meal at which Christ is the Lord who is present the way pagan gods are thought to be present in some of their meals. So there are these ritual behaviors that they have that identify them collectively as followers of this God and of Jesus. They also, however, and so in one sense we would say, well, okay, they have their rituals, so that's not that different. Their rituals are different in that with all the other religious movements that we know about, including religious movements such as Mithraism, which also was very much a kind of tightly organized group. You joined by undergoing rituals. You had a whole body of rituals that appears through which you progressed through different levels of success in the cult. We don't know a great deal about it because they didn't write books. But we know, we think that they were, a group that formed conventicles. They had underground shrines that they met and performed certain rituals. But the point was, with them, you could join the Mithras cult, and it made no difference whatsoever to your other religious associations. You continued to worship the gods of your city, your family, your inherited deities. Okay, you took on this new god, Mithras, but it was like an add-on, an optional or avocational step in addition to your other religious activities. The difference with baptism in early Christianity, for example, was if you underwent Christian baptism and joined the Christian group, you were to renounce all of your other religious associations. Christianity was not an additional religious avocation to your religious repertoire. You were to forsake the entire repertoire otherwise, and this was to be your exclusive religious commitment.
So then how is the role of the book for early Christianity a distinctive thing? Because in contemporary kind of early church history and stuff, there's been a lot of emphasis on the orality and this type of thing, but you've also kind of advocated that the bookish side of Christianity is a distinctive and communicates something specific about Christian identity.
Yeah, I wouldn't want just to deal with one thing quickly. I don't think that it's right to play off against each other what people call orality, that is to say the prizing of the spoken word and the tremendous effort, emphasis and appreciation in the ancient world of rhetoric, of the ability to speak and communicate orally, and of the use of oral modes of communication in the ancient world in general. I wouldn't want to play that down at all. It obviously had a very prominent place. Indeed, my criticism in a couple of journal articles and to some degree in that chapter in the book is not to say orality was unimportant, but rather to say that some of the people who emphasize orality do so at the expense of recognizing the important place of books and writings in early Christianity, and indeed in the Roman world at large. So people say, well, only a small percentage of people could read. Yes. And that's sort of irrelevant because in any group of 3 or 4 or 10 people, all you need is one person who can read, and everybody has the benefit of the text. They have the text read out to them, and so they all know what the text says if you have only one person capable of reading it. So it doesn't in any way work against the power and influence of text. It doesn't take much to facilitate the exercise of text. One competent person will do it for 1,000 people. One reader in 1,000 could read the text out and everybody knows it. The point I'm making is that when we actually just look at the data, early Christianity is comprised of people who are maniacally writing, copying, distributing, and exchanging texts from the earliest moments onward. For example, I went through a catalog of early Christian literature, one of the well-known early catalogs of early Christian literature. And if you go down to about the year 250, the first 2.5 centuries of early Christianity, by my count, there are well in excess of 200 Christian books that we know about that were newly composed by Christians in that period. And keep in mind, they were only, a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of people, most of whom, yes, were illiterate. All the more remarkable that you have a few hundred books that they're writing, and we also know that they were fanatically copying and distributing them translocally, exchanging them with one another. And we have the actual artifacts, fragments of early Christian manuscripts from this very early period that are the physical proof of this. So it's that prominence of texts and writings that first has to be recognized and set alongside the orality of early Christianity, not played off against each other. The second thing to say is, and if you compare the number of texts and the efforts that early Christians spent in reading, copying, and distributing them with any other religious movement of the time, it's incomparable. It's exceptional. And I would say even in comparison to the larger mother tradition, Judaism, which is much larger at that time, I still think that there does not appear to be the same level of textual productivity, so to speak, that we see in early Christianity.
So when I was thinking about the book and going, well, let's imagine a minister is listening to this, gets the book and goes, this is a good topic. I got to preach this at some point next year. What text am I going to go to? I thought of Paul talking to the philosophers, where you quote, God's where we live, move, and have our being. Then you do some distinctively Jewish language. And then when he talks about the resurrection of the dead, they think that's the name of the deity. And he gets all these different reactions. But you tell me if that's a good place to go, or if you have another idea, because the helpfulness of a book like this for congregations trying to understand their distinctive Christian identity in a time that's surprisingly more similar to the early church than most of Christendom, I think is an asset. And introducing it by engaging text will be, I think, a powerful way of framing the conversation. Well,
I hadn't thought of that, what you were saying at the early part. I hadn't thought of key biblical texts on which to base sermons. As I say, the book wasn't written primarily to shape preaching, but just to shape people's understanding of their cultural past, whether they are practicing adherence of Christianity or not. Mm-hmm. You're shaped by it. You're influenced by it. And the point I'm making is that you have incorporated all sorts of assumptions, commonplace views for you, whether you are a Christian or not. And part of the purpose of the book is to say, and you know where these things came from. You may not like it, but it actually originated in early Christianity in the first 3 centuries. So I was really more trying to, in some sense, disturb people along those lines rather than provide preaching texts. But to say something of its practical effect, yes, and return to that, there are 2 types of readers, I suppose, that I would hope the book would have some effect upon. One is the person who says, I'm not a Christian myself, and I don't particularly want to be. They may be a practitioner of another religion, or they may say, I'm not religious at all. But I still think you will find the book interesting and informative and surprising in many ways, mm-hmm. pointing out to you how very different earliest Christianity was from the institutional Christianity that you may know today. But also how, as I say, how very much a number of things that you think are just inevitable commonplaces actually were historically generated in early Christianity. So that's the one thing. The other type of reader is, the modern day Christian of whatever stripe, who likewise, I think, will not recognize how different likely their modern versions of Christianity are from its originating impulse in the first 3 centuries. And so, it's like, in some sense, going to Ancestry.com and tracing your family tree and finding those weird and wacky people from 5 centuries ago in Lower Slavovia or whatever who were your ancestors. And you think, holy cow, look at that. They were, some of them were horse thieves, or some of them were, child traffickers or whatever, and some of them may have been clergymen or whatever. So you find, gee, my ancestry is much more interesting and surprising and perhaps even embarrassing than I thought it was. So I would hope that Christians, will say, do you care at all about looking at the originating impulse of the tradition that you claim to be part of? You might find this interesting. You might find it upsetting. You might find it disturbing, but it's the way it is, Jack, and it's worth looking at. The final point, I guess I would say you were hinted at there. Yes, I do agree that for the last century or more, we are, with increasing speed, moving out of Christendom. We are, people describe it as a post-Christian world. It is certainly a post-Christendom world. That is to say, it is no longer a world in which, in virtually any of the countries of European and European influenced culture, no longer the case that Christianity is exercises a kind of control over the society in the way it once did. It's no longer, has the power of the state to enforce itself. Christianity, once again, is simply one religious option among others in a much more overtly pluralistic, religiously pluralistic world than it was before. Okay, Hindus were always in India. Buddhists were always in India and parts of China. Nowadays, of course, your dentist might be a Buddhist or a Hindu. The guy next door who's running a business may be a Sikh or whatever. So the religious plurality is right now on your block, in your face, and in your society in a way of which it wasn't before. And in that sense, yes, it actually is much, much closer to the situation of the first 2 to 3 centuries, in which Christianity and other gods and multiplicity of gods and religious movements were swirling in a rambunctious way all through that period. And Christians in particular were not able to draw upon the power of the state or some kind of long-standing tradition to justify themselves. Christians and their faith had to commend their message solely by its ability to persuade people morally, to do moral suasion, to persuade people freely to say, by George, I think this may be right. Christians had to live by their wits and by their powers of non-coercive persuasion, so to speak. And that's pretty much the situation we're in now. There are lots of people in churches who lament that, who think that that's a terrible thing. Prayer is no longer enforced in school. They've taken the nativity scene off the county seat back, a lot. We can't, we can't expect, the Lord's Prayer to appear in City Hall anymore. And you think, yes. And frankly, I have to say, I think that's to the good. I think it's a better situation. It is healthier for Christianity to be forced to live by its wits again and to be forced to commend itself not by coercive power, but by its ability to win the hearts of people. And I would say any religion should be required to live or die by its ability to do that. And if a religion can't succeed in commending itself in a non-coercive way, then I think, frankly, it deserves to die.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I find helpful about the situation is the number of people who then recognize that they had inherited a stack of conclusions, but the content of those conclusions they aren't that sure of. They aren't even sure exactly what it means. And one of the places in your work I've really enjoyed is the way in which you emphasize that the role of devotion to Jesus in the early church is the place in which the content of our affirmation of Jesus, his relationship to the Father, and our understanding of him as his human and divine develops. So if you were sitting down with Christians and trying to invite them back to those early expressions of devotion of Jesus in the early church in this very odd Roman world that we're in, where would you describe them or kind of point them to begin in starting to understand the heartbeat of those confessions and not just the conclusions?
Well, I think, my specialty, my academic specialty is New Testament and earliest Christian texts. And so you'll forgive me for saying that I think that they remain the most important texts for people to look to. They're expressions of how people express their devotion and their loyalty to God and to Christ. Still, I think, are the most instructive and most inspirational. And as I've said, more increasingly relevant in our post-Christendom situation. So with great respect to my colleagues who work in subsequent centuries, I would say that I think that writings of the first 2 centuries are probably more instructive for how to be, how to live out Christian faith in a pluralistic society today than Augustine or Aquinas or Luther or Wesley or any of the greats that people have written oodles of PhD theses on and figures on whom books keep rolling off the press. These are great men, great thoughts, but they weren't dealing with the situation that we're dealing with today. The people who are dealing with a situation much closer to ours are people of the first 2 centuries. New Testament writings, Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Epistle of Diognetus, Tertullian, people of that period of the first 2 or 3 centuries are much more instructive. So that would be my first thing, is if you want to read some Christian text to get an idea of how the heck to be a Christian in that kind of pluralized world, put aside your Augustine and read those people. They will be much more instructive. The second thing that you'll find is that in that early period, there was a diversity of beliefs. People emphasized different things, but across various groups, there was a readiness to extend a fraternal acceptance of diversity. My clearest indication of this is the New Testament itself. Anybody who looks at the New Testament squarely will surely recognize that it is a bundle of diversity. Over against many, many Christians, what do we have? 4 Gospels. And no 2 of the 4 agrees perfectly. They each of them has its own particular emphasis and unique material and spin, you might say, on the Jesus narrative. Recognizably, they're all 4 about Jesus, but they say quite distinguishable things. And some Christians in the early centuries said, oh, this won't do it all. This won't do it all. We have to find one gospel and make it the right gospel. Clear example of that, of course, is the 2nd century figure Marcion, who insisted there could only be one true gospel and there could only one true apostle, and hated the diversity, it appears, that was already there in early Christianity. Over against that, quite reasonable point of view, actually, but over against that, bless their hearts, the emerging so-called Orthodox, early Orthodox Christianity said, no, by George, we want these 4 Gospels, and we're not going to knock off the edges and blend them together and force some kind of harmony, the way another early Christian figure, Tatian, did, but we're going to let all 4 of them stand, warts and all, and they're all 4 valid, with their diversity. Likewise, instead of just having texts of one apostle, the New Testament incorporates writings attributed to Paul, to Peter, to James, to John. And anybody who sits down and looks at, say, Paul's letter to the Galatians and then reads it alongside the epistle of James has got to say to himself, how do I hold both of these things together? They certainly seem to be saying different things. At moments, they seem to be saying contradictory things. They're certainly very different. Well, it's interesting. The early church basic again says, no, by George, Paul and James in the same collection. So in varying ways, the New Testament represents a deliberate, a kind of feisty, almost deliberate effort to put together diversity. It is a kind of ecumenical diversity and is illustrative of, I think, the so-called proto-Orthodox nature of the first couple of centuries. It was not a uniformity, but a unity in diversity. And the New Testament is a very clear artifactual expression of that. So one of the things also I would say that we need to learn is to desist from the mania for doctrinal uniformity, for example, that has, I think, afflicted Christian relations for the last 1,500 years at least. And interesting, this week, the big news was that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and the current Pope, Pope Francis, met and got on together, had tea together, and Justin, for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury reportedly gave him his pectoral cross as a gift. And sometime back, the Pope had given one of Welby's predecessors a papal ring as a token of saying, well, we're very different, but we can at least shake hands and have a cup of tea together. And this was like, headline news. These 2 guys agreed that they weren't going to hate each other. Well, big deal, in some sense. It's still, however, they're saying, but we still have differences, so we can't celebrate communion together. We can't really get together because we disagree about some things. The early church is full of disagreement.
Yeah.
And so the other thing I would say is, if you want to learn what it means to be a Christian in the original sense of the word, it means to recognize a diversity in Christian beliefs. And you basically have to learn to accept any other Christian who will accept you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a powerful statement. In one of the, like, even the story of the Archbishop and the Pope, one of the frustrating things for me is they're way more similar than whoever wrote Mark and John. Yeah. Like, those two Christologies could not be further apart. If Jesus and John knows he's the Logos, says I am all the time, people fall over in the garden. And in Mark, he dies with just, why did you forsake me, and women who don't tell anyone. There's one of the biggest problems, I think, of the church around this issue is that we aren't orthodox enough, that our canon and our bonds spiritually in the body of Christ should preserve and cultivate a diversity of expressions, because the thread that runs through the New Testament in the life of the church is that we can't help but talk about our experience and relationship to God as mediated by Jesus. We are going to confess Him, and it's going to sound different. And the insistence that you're not going to pick one like Marcion, not harmonize them like Tatian, and not take some counsel and then enforce it as if Paul and Mark are Trinitarians. Once you allow the diversity, I think then the councils and the creeds and the confessions of people throughout history become increasing testimonies to the text that we continue to read and trust, as opposed to, I don't know, hermeneutical guides to then fit our theology back in, 70 and 80 CE.
Yes, I agree. One of the, if we're looking to a biblical text, one of the texts that I have several times spoken to before ministers, when you have different groups of ministers and different kinds of Christians get together, is a passage in the New Testament epistle to the Ephesians. And in chapter 4, the text says, let us strive to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, forgiving and forbearing one another in love. And then it talks about the various gifts that God has given. And then it says, until we attain the unity of the faith. Now, it's interesting. Unity of the faith, which Christendom has been striving to try to hammer out for the last 1,500 years, unity of the faith is described in the epistle to the Ephesians as an eschatological future divine gift that may happen at some point in God's good time. In the meantime, what you have now is, of course, you don't have unity of the faith. What is commanded in the text is not to achieve unity of the faith, but you are to achieve and strive for unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, forgiving and forbearing one another. And as I've sometimes said to people, you don't have to forgive and forbear anyone who is intelligent enough to agree with you. It's only those boneheads who insist on seeing something some other way who you have to forgive and forbear. So the text presupposes boneheads who disagree with each other and says, yeah, but what you are to do is to maintain, you don't have unity of the faith. You are to maintain unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, forbearing and forgiving one another. What do you do with some bonehead who will not agree with you that your point of view is right? You forbear him, which means simply you put up with him. And it doesn't prevent you from sharing Eucharist together, or should not, from making common cause together in feeding the poor and the hungry and talking about Jesus and advocating Christian values of behavior. So as I say, one of the things that I'm actually hoping that the eclipse of Christendom may lead to is some kind of return, among other things, some kind of return to the kind of respect for and acceptance of and embrace of, in some sense, a unity and diversity, such as I think the Ephesians chapter 4 is advocating.
When you think of this issue, not just at the macro level of like kind of ecumenical movements or the historical level, I think underneath it, there's also the very practical level that in most of our congregations, there is a silent orthodoxy over what you're allowed to say you believe or don't believe out loud, doubt or affirm. And our canon and our tradition is modeling the ability for those diverse types of affirmations and confessions to be present together. And I remember when I did a sermon series where I preached the resurrection story in all four gospels in a very like redaction criticism type of way, and trying to like get at kind of the affirmation as each gospel writer is trying to in their own voice, and it getting done and going into church council and very early on, Reverend, I just had a real quick question. I really like the John one. I mean, you didn't talk about the Trinity enough, but I like the John one. My husband, I mean, he's an atheist, but he's in our bell choir. He really liked the Mark one, and he said that if that's in the Bible, then he probably should be allowed to join the church. He really wants to love like Jesus. He's just not quite sure on all the other stuff all the time, but this is his community. It's where he wants to belong, and that made me uncomfortable. And it, you know, I was doing it more as like an academic exercise of helping people see the diversity there, and then realized that we have answers in our tradition for dealing with the real life diversity of the communities we serve and live with. And that when the diversity of voices in our canon are given space in the congregation, there are people there who finally get their voice and understanding spoken. And then the diversity and harmony that's built within people across difference, that I think is a strength to this bond of Christ, is able to come out.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, the New Testament writings talk about, instructing one another. Well, obviously, if you require everybody to believe exactly the same thing, there's no need to be instructing each other, right? But you're trying to instruct each other or reason with each other where you recognize that there are differences. And it doesn't mean that you say, oh, I'm sorry, we disagree, so we will just stop talking.
Yeah.
No, you start talking at that point. And it just means that you may or may not wind up agreeing with each other, but you freely exchange. Oh, that's a very different point of view. Tell me more about how you got to that. Seems a little cockeyed to me, but tell me how you get there. I want to know more about that because I respect you enough to allow you to say what your reasons are. And I'll tell you, I don't think I agree with you. I'll tell you why I think otherwise. And, we can argue with each other and reason. And then after we're finished with it, if we make any progress, okay. If we don't, okay. We'll then have communion with each other and say, praise the Lord. You're a brother. I may think you're a bit cockeyed in some things, but you're a brother and what the heck, God will sort it all out in the end. The mistake of mistaking uniformity and unity. Unity does not require uniformity. And particularly the kind of unity that Ephesians 4 talks about, unity of the Spirit, not unity of the faith, unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace.
So one other question I had is, when you have recognized the diversity of Christologies in the early church, the story of the different controversies in its development and that type of thing, how do you understand God's ongoing role in the development of Christian theology? Because I think one of the challenges has been for theologians, or really kind of the power key holders of the tradition, to take the conclusions and impose it back on the past. And there's a fear that they lose authority when they admit that our conclusions are an evolutionary process that goes different directions and take different processes. But is there a way that you imagine that history not just as a stale objective history, but a product of the Holy Spirit and the life of Christ in the early church?
Well, as a Christian, I mean, that's not a historical statement. To ask the question, is God actually working there? I don't understand to be a historical question, but a theological, religious question. And as a practicing Christian, yes, I believe God is present in the actions and the phenomena that we see witnessed in a special important way in the New Testament writings. And I believe that and hope that God has been active in the kind of history that has worked down through it, along with an awful lot of regrettable and ambiguous human actions that have gainsaid and prevented God's will. One of them being, to mention one thing that comes along later after the period I deal with, the regrettable, tragic, long history of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish treatment, supposedly in the name of Christ and in the name of the Christian God. Whereas I believe that God's purpose was always for what we call Christianity to bear witness to the God of Israel and bear witness to Jewish people of the God of Israel, embracing the Gentiles in a powerful way, in a way that might even be winsome for Jews to treat seriously and ask questions about how Jesus is meaningful for them as well. But the anti-Semitism and persecuting of Jews down through nearly 1,500 years now, in the name of Christianity, has certainly made that well nigh impossible for Jews to, in most cases, to consider the figure of Jesus without recoiling from something that they associate with hatred and violent persecution. So, yes, the history of Christianity has been, to put it mildly, ambiguous and in many ways regrettable. I would hope that God hasn't given up on the process and may still be able to help some light shine through. The point about theology is that all good theology, all human attempts to articulate in words and concepts something about God is always historically and culturally and intellectually conditioned. And any good theology takes that seriously and grasps the intellectual categories of its time, the cultural categories of its time, and seeks to articulate Christianity, engaging and drawing upon those conceptual tools. And that's why, for example, therefore, the doctrinal controversies that roiled early Christians in the 4th century and 5th century, the way in which they engaged the question of God and Christ, are not quite serviceable for us because they were working with conceptual categories that we don't work with. That's not to blame them. They had no choice. Indeed, it would have been irresponsible not to engage the philosophical categories of their time and try to come up with, homoousios, Christ of one substance with the Father. That was the responsible kind of question to take up. But we don't work with, what is divine substance? I don't know what that is. They thought they did, and God bless them, they did their best to try to engage that question. Christian theology today probably works with other categories of understanding how to talk about God. We don't talk about God's substance, I don't think, so much anymore. We talk about God's attributes or behavior, maybe, in a much more dynamic way. So all good Christian theology has to change its articulation. It's not changing its God, but it is changing the way in which God is talked about, God is perceived, articulated. In order to be responsible, it has to do that. And it has to, the categories and the formulas that worked in the 15th century don't work for us today. And it's a kind of mug's game to force people to pretend that they are 15th century people in order to be faithful to their tradition. No, you have to be 21st century people, and you have to find out what are the appropriate and most responsible ways of talking about God in terms that correspond to our intellectual furniture.
Well, that is a seriously wonderful, excellent conversation. I thank you so much for joining us. And if you're listening, remember the book, Destroyer of the Gods, and also the other one that was titled something similar to one of my questions about why you would be a Christian.
Why on earth would anyone become a Christian in the first 3 centuries?
There you go. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will look forward to another book coming out so we can do it again.
Okay. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.